Okay, is everybody seeing the screen? Okay, let's talk about how to make it intentional. How to rewrite as a neurodivergent or rewriting for neurodivergence. My name is Joe Weinberg. I am an author and editor, and I teach writing currently at Concordia University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Um, and yeah, let's talk about how to do this. So the first step of it, especially for my fellow pantsers out there, is to just write. Write whatever you have to say the whole thing, write the whole novel, tell the whole story. Neil Gaiman said something along the lines of the first draft, you put out the story, second draft, you make it look like it was on purpose. And that's kind of the goal of what I'm looking to talk about today. Trying to make the second draft look like everything that you said was on purpose. So when you're first writing, take it with the full-on seat of the pants philosophy of just put one word in front of the other, let the whole thing come out. Don't worry about being consistent. Feel free to surprise yourself with twists. Yesterday, a lot of us were talking about how, as a pantser, we kind of surprise ourselves with the things that we say. The story just kind of gets away from you and takes along a life of its own. And I want to encourage everyone to do that. Let it have that life of its own and experience it and have all the fun of it as you go. But once you've finished your first draft, then you have to make like you did it on purpose. You have to look like everything that you intended to do was there as you intended it, not just coming out of you the way it did when you first wrote it. So you're trying to kind of target what you're doing, and part of that is a targeting of the audience, but part of it is also just targeting in on maybe which parts of the story are the most important, which characters are the most interesting, which plot lines work and which ones don't, and finding out ways to kind of get them all together. Because, and this is the reason I had the picture of Gordon Ramsay, what you have in the first draft really is just a bunch of ingredients. And you have to kind of move them around and arrange them in order to make something that is really good and worth eating. So how do we do that? One way to do it is to do an outline. Outline is usually the province of the plotter. They usually make the outlines ahead of time and figure out what they're going to do, and so they don't often have the problem of randomness that we pantsers have. But after the fact, sometimes it can be really useful to do an outline, to go through an outline scene by scene, everything that happens, so that you have an idea of where the twists are, so that you know where you're going off track and where you're going off on tangents and when that's okay. And so that you can see the structure of the story as it comes out, and then you can tweak that structure. It can help you find out things like, where do you want to put the foreshadowing for this? Or do you want to have this scene that actually happens earlier on? Do you want to put it later on and do a flashback? What kind of twist do you want to set up? What are you going to say? Are you going to do some kind of parallel structure? Parallel structure is something that I like to do a lot in stories that I write, where I'll have two stories going on that are paralleling each other in what's actually happening for each one. And so as things happen in one story that may be telling you about something that happened in the past, it will actually preview what the twist will be. And I don't do that when I'm first writing through it. I have to do that second time through because I don't know what the twists are until I get to the point. So a lot of times the second draft is where you realize, okay, I need a scene here in order to have this twist later make sense. Or I need to introduce this character early on because later on when he does this important thing, he can't seem like he's coming out of nowhere. And so a lot of that is the kind of thing that you're going to do when you're editing from one step to the next. And while I do have a picture here of editing in the sense of line editing, I'm more talking about developmental editing, where you're taking the story as a whole and trying to make it make more sense and fit more in the sense of what you're doing. So one of the things that you're going to be doing is foreshadowing, because if you have a big twist, you got to make sure that you are teasing that twist early so that some people are going to get it and then feel very clever when they do. I know when I first started reading mystery novels, my main thing was I would start reading the novel, and then every time I came up with who I thought had done it, I would write down the page I was on when I thought about it, and then who I thought done it. And so I could change my mind as I went, but I'd at least have an idea. And that way, if it turned out that I was right, then I felt super clever. But realistically, if I felt super clever, it was because the author did a really good job of teasing that twist early on so that I was able to come up with that answer. And so when it all came out in the end as that being who did it, then I would suddenly understand who it was. Um, One of the best places I've seen doing this lately is in the Knives Out movies. In Glass Onion, I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but there's a very early on revelation of one character having an allergy, and that allergy is later used to kill that character. And if you watch it, you can see as characters take note of that allergy. And you can hear these things coming up. And there's a lot of great little tiny details in there that you maybe won't notice on the first viewing, but they allow it to really play fair, which I think is a very important thing to do, especially when you're doing things like foreshadowing. You have to make sure that you play fair. That's what using good foreshadowing is. It's giving the audience a chance to be able to guess and be able to see these things, because otherwise you're going to end up with things coming out of nowhere and a villain who doesn't appear until the last act of the story, and that's never as satisfying. You may have the villain not appear to the last act of the story in the first draft, but that's why we're going back through and doing this. You're going to put in those foreshadowing, put in those flashbacks, and make sure that they're in the right order. You're going to make sure that the flashbacks apply to what's happening in the present time span. Because if you just do a random story of flashbacks, which you can do, you can have two separate storylines that don't really parallel each other, but just are happening simultaneously. But it's best if they do in some way parallel each other. They provide information. They show a mistake that was made the last time that the character won't make this time. Things like that is a really good way to use flashbacks. I'm saying a lot. Okay. Here's the problem. What if you come up with this twist and now everyone sees it coming? It feels like it's the end of the world. Don't panic. Sometimes you're going to have something that is a twist that the audience knows is a twist, knows is coming, isn't surprised, isn't shocked at all, but the character is. And the character can be completely shocked as long as, even if the audience isn't, as long as you set up the twist well enough. In a novel that I wrote, that's coming out sometime this year, the main character AJ kind of figures out who the killer is, but then forgets about it because things just keep distracting her from the situation, or she convinces herself that it's not the case. But the reader is well aware that she's right and then dismisses the right answer and starts searching down the wrong answer. And while that can be a little bit frustrating, hopefully, if you handle it right. Yeah. Christine just said that about half the readers figure out who the villain is, but the main character is always surprised. It's great to have the main character always be surprised, because there will always be some people who are reading it who don't pick up on the little clues. And then when the main character is surprised, and so are they don't feel like they were dumb for not having figured it out, because neither did the main character. And how could they be expected to figure it out if the main character didn't? And that's all well and good. There is a lot of experimentation that happens here, because a lot of the time you're going to try and go one way and maybe go too far. The best example I can think of this is the Michael Crichton book, Prey. I'm a big fan of Michael Crichton, love his stuff. But in Prey, early on in the book, like maybe 100 pages into the book, you're given a tour of this facility, and one of the machines they come across is like an MRI machine. And like, we have to be very careful with this, because if we turn on this machine while the nanos are out and about, the magnetism will destroy all the nanos and it would ruin the entire experiment. And this is before the nanos have gone crazy, which of course they're going to, because why wouldn't they? And then maybe another 100 pages later, when the nanos do go crazy, every character starts saying, well, but what are we supposed to do? How do we fight them? There's nothing we can do. And for the next 300 pages, they keep trying one thing after another while I was yelling at the book, sometimes out loud, just use the goddamn MRI machine. You spent all this time setting up how this machine will destroy all of them. Go and use it. And it's not until like 500 pages in the book that somebody finally goes, oh, hey, what about that? I almost threw the book across the room. So there is such a thing as making something too obvious, too clear. I think Crichton would have been better off if his editor had said to him, hey, why don't you have somebody figure this out nice and early and then put things that will stop them from getting to the MRI machine, rather than them trying to figure out some other thing and not realizing that they have the off button the whole time. And so as editors, that's kind of our job, is to find those moments where you made the twist too obvious. Okay, do we want to pull back a little? Or do we want to make the twist come sooner and just have the character have a bunch of problems getting through the twist? We're getting to it. So now the question is, what can we avoid? And this is a time when I would love suggestions from you guys. So I'm going to tell you one more story about a book that ruined its series for me because of a random box. And then we'll talk about what you guys think. My uncle, Alan Troop, wrote a series of novels about a dragon who had taken human form, living in Miami and going about his life, normal urban fantasy kind of stuff. And I was really enjoying it. But in the third book, he had the character find a box filled with potions and never explained what the potions did. But later on in the book, he needed to fight off other dragons and went and found the potions. And lo and behold, the potions made him into a much larger dragon, was able to fight them off. And I couldn't help but feel like that was cheating. I felt like if he had done just one more pass as an editor, if the right editor had just said to him, why don't you have him, when he finds the box, find a picture on the box that shows that this makes you get bigger? And then later on, when he is running from these other two dragons, trying to find something to help him defeat them, then he can remember the box and can go to the potions. But as long as you show him the potions beforehand and what they do, it doesn't feel like cheating. Because the way that it was, it felt like cheating. And as somebody who is autistic, when the author cheats, it really drives me crazy because it's so easy not to. You know, we don't all have to write Robinson Crusoe where he finds absolutely everything he could possibly need all of the time really easily. We need to make sure that if he finds a box of supplies, that the audience knows every single supply that's in that box before he starts using any of it. The other thing that you can do with making various kinds of foreshadowing and determining what kinds of twists and turns there are going to be is you can put in little things to try and make people sinister. Some things are really easy to make them sinister. You just, like this guy in the tuxedo, make him look kind of undead. A little bit of makeup is going to make him look sinister. This thing with the dog is from The Simpsons, where Homer suggests you can always tell that the dog is evil by just having him look side to side a lot and zoom in on his eyes like this. And then, of course, there's good old Julian, who some of you may recognize as the main villain in the Poltergeist movies. And he was just creepy looking on the face of it. So if you really wanted to make someone sinister, all you got to do is describe them as looking like him. Because I can't think of anybody since who has been able to just put on a friendly smile and be that incredibly creepy and sinister. But I'd love to hear from you guys. What are some things that you should avoid when you're fixing up that second draft, when you're trying to make sure that the twists are still twists, but are a little bit harder to spot? The things that allow us to see that something is going to come and a change that is going to happen. What are the little breadcrumbs that you guys will put or suggest that somebody put into their books? and their stories. Anybody? I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you don't have to keep looking at him. I'm convinced there are some people who are still traumatized by the. Oh yeah, repeat the question. What kinds of things do you guys do? Either when if you're as a writer or as an editor. So as a writer, what do you do when you have a twist to show that the twist is coming? Love more information on that. Writing a mystery investigation novel, trying to figure out which breadcrumbs to leave when and where has been really tricky. Yeah, so that's what I want to talk about, is what breadcrumbs to leave. Where do you leave them? When do you leave them? What kinds of things do you say? And Jason, off the top of my head, and these are very informal, but the basic rules for mystery is you got to make sure that the killer always is one of the initial suspects. That would be my major rule, and it's not a rule so much as just a personal preference. Whoever the initial suspects are, one of them has to be the actual killer. If you have a suspect that comes in later, it really feels like you just threw him in there. I think clues to the detective, but also hidden clues within the clues to the readers. Yeah. Short stories tend to show the obvious goals and then undermine the shit out of those goals within the last paragraph or line. It's another type of cheating, in my opinion. It doesn't make for satisfying reveal. The only reveal is, the author lied to me. Yeah, it's fun to leave clues in totally innocuous places. Like, there's no way this will be significant. It reminds me of something I was talking about with E yesterday. That we don't, as autistics, don't tend to write details that aren't important. So you don't describe a room unless there's something important in that room. You just say they're in a room. But that might be somewhere where you can put those kinds of clues. Conspiracy. There's conspiracy. One person can be obvious, but then there's a mystery about why no one else is involved. Who else is involved and why? Yeah. I mean, if you're doing a mystery in the classic British sense, then everybody has a secret and a reason why they don't want to help the detective. They all have something that they don't want to come out about what happened. So they all have some modicum of guilt, even if it's not guilt about the murder. Like, even if they're not the murderer, they still did something that they're not proud of and they don't want anybody to find out about. Or something that would make it look like they would be the murderer. So they all have a secret of some kind. But sometimes you can describe things in rooms that turn out to be significant, and you may not realize that they're significant when you first write them. That's what the second round through is about. And sometimes you can put in clues that are red herrings. And one of my favorites, you could put in dogs that don't bark. That's a clue, much like Jason was talking about, with a clue that's a hidden clue within the clue for the reader. The dog that didn't bark is a concept where imagine you had there was a guard dog and the dog was in the room when the murder happened or was in the house when the murder happened and the dog didn't bark. Well, that's a clue because it means the dog knew whoever it was that did the killing. So it's a way of telling the detective that the dog was familiar with or was somehow taken out of play by the killer. So either the dog knew the killer, or at the very least, the killer knew about and planned for the dog. So there's a lot to be said for clues that are the lack of something. If you open up a safe and there's a dust outline of something, that's a clue. You know, that's something that was stolen. If there are ashes in the fireplace, that's a clue something was burned. Every little detail that you put in, by themselves, they may not be all that important, but as you gather them all together, you get to your final answer. And that's why a lot of the times I think it's better to write the whole thing, because then you know what the final answer is. And you know, okay, well, he was killed by his business associate who burned up something that he had evidence of in his safe. Excuse me. But the business associate knew about the dog, so came over, petted the dog, made sure the dog was okay, let him out for the night, went, murdered the guy, broke into his safe, burned the evidence, and then let the dog back in and left. But you can put all of those little clues in once you know the answer. Okay, John said, I used the parallel story thing to make 3 points of view, one from the character who kills X in Act 1, another from the friend of Y, who seeks vengeance against an unknown rival, and the third POV from a third party who ends up confronting Y in Act 3 after it gets revealed that vengeance target is the X's killer from Act 1. Yeah, the parallel story structure is a really interesting thing to do because you can have things that are happening asynchronously seem like they're all happening at once, which is very cool. Okay, Jason, in my story, there's no singular killer. The villain is more an organization, doesn't fully realize until near the end. Big reveals more. One of the main characters in the beginning knew everything about the situation at hand, but couldn't directly tell the detective. That sort of lead in there. Okay, I would say your first question, Jason, is why? Why couldn't they tell the detective? Are they part of this organization? And is it a fear of, if I tell you about this, then you're going to think that I did it? Or is it just you're going to think that the organization did it? So does this person know that the organization is the killer, so to speak? You're going to need to make sure that you tease that organization a couple of times throughout the story, either with the other things that they do or not. Hang on. They're indirectly related to the organization and they're bound to secrecy. It's kind of a magic involved. Okay. If they're magically bound to secrecy, like if there's something magically that literally prevents them from saying anything, that's way easier to handle why they didn't tell the detective to begin with. But you might have something in there where it's clear that they're trying to tell the detective something that they can't tell him. And that will kind of tease the idea and make that character look weirdly sinister because you know that the character is trying to help, but you also know that they're involved with something that is making it so that they can't. It's a great way to be able to have that sort of thing happen. I love mysteries and urban fantasy. I think those are the best way to do it because there's so much you can do when a locked room isn't even something to slow you down. I recently wrote one where part of the problem was that the character was in the locked room with the victim when the victim was killed. And the only way it could be done, and the way it was done, was with magic. But because magic isn't a commonly known thing, she couldn't just say that. Huge Jim Butcher fan. His style in Jerusalem Files is a huge inspiration. Yeah, Jim Butcher does much less the type of mystery we've been talking about and much more the American hard-boiled style, where the figuring out who did it isn't nearly as important as either getting them to confess or somehow getting them getting a piece of evidence that you can actually present about them. Is that it can't be him, he's harmless idea cheating. Female main character stalker, or the male main character keeps assistance, particular character, but couldn't be him. It's just no, that's not cheating at all. That's absolutely. I think that's a totally viable way of doing it. It's great to dismiss somebody and say, "Oh no, it can't be him. He's harmless," or "He saved my life. Why would he be trying to kill me?" And then it's just a matter of switching the context or having the reader realize something that the character doesn't. So I would say that what you have, Samantha, there is you have a female main character who has a stalker and a male main character who keeps insisting that the stalker is one particular character, but the female saying it's not because he's so nice. So you have there, the male main character is going to be standing in for the reader who is just yelling at the page, "It's that guy. How can you not see that it's him? Look at it. It's so obvious." But she's saying, no, he's too nice. It couldn't be him. And you're going to have to do some things to show how he is, or at least coming off as so nice. But yeah, that absolutely, I wouldn't qualify that as cheating in any way. an experienced cop or detective would suspect someone who seems unsuspicious, maybe, but that's also a great way to do a red herring. Maybe you have somebody who seems unsuspicious, and then it turns out that the reason they seemed unsuspicious is because they were. Um, cops don't suspect. A seasoned detective is going to suspect everybody, but as people prove themselves, they'll stop suspecting them. Because you kind of have to eliminate suspects as you go, or else you're never going to make any progress. But you may end up having to pull back a suspect later on. So you may have dismissed somebody, maybe because they're too nice or because they had an alibi, and then you find out that, oh, they're not as nice as they thought they were, or, oh, that alibi is not as alibalicious as it used to be. I don't think that's a word, but I like it. Alibalicious. I'm going to put that in the chat. Alibalicious. Quality of an alibi. Yeah, the problem with having the main character be an experienced cop or detective is that then you have to use procedures, and you have to learn those procedures and know how they work and know how actual police work is done. And unless that's something you're interested in researching, that's not nearly as much fun as having your detective be an amateur. The amateur detective is kind of a staple of the field, I think. I love making people who shouldn't be detectives into detectives. Person says that already knows everything from point A to point B. They cannot tell them about B or C, so they say, hey, help me with A, then lead them slowly towards C. Yeah. I would really consider, Jason, putting in a scene where they're trying to give a certain piece of information, but then can't. They're magically prevented from doing so. And so they do their best to kind of talk around it, but make sure that the main character notes that there was something they wanted to say but couldn't. That'll also allow you to keep that character as a potential allied character in future novels, because even if they are, it turns out, working for the bad guy, they may not be working for the bad guy next time, and the audience will still trust them if they were trying to give the information but just couldn't. Yeah. Yeah, Lindsay, the underdog. Everybody does like the underdog, so it makes sense that I like making my detectives into underdogs, or making underdogs into my detectives. But I also just like seeing that a lot of the skills of detective are useful in other places, or there are skills that would be useful for a detective. Like in my Sam Archer series, I have Sam as the detective, and he's more of a authenticator of artifacts. So he's used to looking at details and figuring out what things mean, which is a lot of the skills of a detective, but he's not really used to actual detective work. And then in the more recent one I have with AJ, who is a tattoo artist, she's used to, again, looking very closely at details and making sure to follow things through and to play within the lines, so to speak. But has no real skill as a detective. So she just kind of rambles and wanders around. She goes with much more the American style, which is what I like to think of as you wander around and you ask people questions until somebody tries to kill you. And then you know that whatever the last set of questions you asked was probably the right set of questions. And so you just keep going with that. Anybody else have any things to avoid or things to suggest for how to do these things? How to take that first draft where you're just rambling through everything and letting it out and having your solution, and then go back and make that solution a little bit harder to find? No? Okay. Well, that was only half an hour, but I think it was a pretty good half an hour. I really appreciate all the comments and suggestions that you guys are making. It's been really helpful, and thank you very much for coming to my talk. It is fun to hear everybody's stories. Yes, Daniel, don't lie to the audience. Don't cheat. Don't directly lie. Good, Sam. Samantha, I'm glad to hear that they're helpful. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Oh, Jason, what's your question? Good. I'm glad. I'm glad. Oh, you guys are all making me so happy. Thank you, Lindsay. Jason, is this a question that we better ask just in person, or do you want to type it out? Oh, there it is. Telling us not reveal the villain to the end. I'm assuming there's no direct villain or investigation. What are your tips for helping keep suspense? Tick and clock narratives are good. Since your villain is an organization rather than an individual person, I would suggest that you have the detective catch somebody who works for the organization and have them die before they can reveal important information. So especially if you get to the point where the organization is now trying to kill the main character, having them fight off a killer, and if need be, killing them in the process, and then they can get more information about the organization that way, without having a full reveal of this is who was behind it. If he kills the guy who came to kill him and he finds a bunch of different ID cards for different places, that might be a suggestion that this is a clandestine organization. Or if he finds maybe a key card that's blank that lets him into a building that he can then go investigate to find out more about the organization or something like that. Yes, my pleasure. Happy to help. Happy to help anytime. Thank you all very much. Bye.